Good day, everyone. I wonder how you're all doing this evening. Shadowy day. I wanted to do this recording earlier, but circumstances. We're gonna have to put up with noises. The girls are busy. Very, very busy. Also, yeah, this is gonna be Politics Live from. Oh bloody hell! There you go. That's me being unprepared for it. Yeah, 15th of Geola, the 8th, Thursday the 8th. I've got another video coming out. I wanted to do that one first, but this one has come up, and I have a funny feeling I'm going to have a lot to say on this. The format being, you can't see what's going on, although I've got the volume up so you guys can hear what's going on. Again, apologies for the noise in the background. The girls are up. What on earth are you doing? But yeah, just like I said, you'll hear everything going on. If I need to describe anything, I'll describe anything. I will put the link of where I'm watching this up, so you guys can tell I'm not bullshitting. So, and I'm watching this off of political TV. So, cheers.
Joining me today, Conservative MP Robin Walker, Labour peer and Shadow Minister Jenny Chapman, former First Minister of Northern Ireland Arlene Foster, and columnist George Monbiot. So, what's going on today?
If the union leaders to continue to be unreasonable, then it is my duty to take action to protect the lives and livelihoods of the British public.
Workers are...
I already said this, yes, on Warden's Day. We barely see Rishi Sunak. We barely see him. And a lot of the ministers are being kept hidden for most days. I mean, I get that he's probably trying not to fall into the same the same problem that both Boris and Truss fell into, but I think he's falling into a completely different trap. Where it's been said that he's falling into a trap where, he's leaving a media gap where Lib Dems and Greens and especially Labour and the SNP can come in and say what they want, and no opposition, barely any pushback from the government on the airwaves. But I think there's another side to it. I say something I've mentioned before, but it's like the Tories can't let go of the 80s, the Thatcher years, and they refuse to forget the 70s. Now, whilst Labour were in power in the 70s, everyone seems to forget for the first 4 years of the 70s, it was actually the Tories in charge. So, I do wonder how that impacts the situation. But, Thatcher herself had to deal with the strikes, and she could only deal with the strikes once she felt she was powerful enough. That was one of the big issues for her was at first she couldn't deal with them. She had to wait until she felt she had enough backing elsewhere to be able to do it. Rishi Sunak hasn't got that at all. he's barely got backing from his own party. And I'll press play again in a second. They can't let go, and despite the fact that they all but hamstrung the unions anyway in the freedoms that they had at that time, they're still trying to say that the unions here are the enemy, and they're trying to pass working people off as the enemy of working people. It's ridiculous. Anyway, sorry.
Are angry, the public's frustrated, the government says it's had enough. But are tougher laws the right way to get people back to work?
No, it's just... The government refuses to understand either... Well, it either understands and is being utterly callous, which is something I'm more willing to back, or it just doesn't understand and it's in its own blinkered ideological view. They just want to. They see the unions as their rivals. So it's getting. But like I said, with the connection with the whole media blackout of Tories, when you do see them on, the only thing they seem to fall back on is, oh, unions this, unions that. Shut the fuck up about the damn unions. They haven't got the power. For them to ballot, the members have to choose to ballot. That's the whole thing. They're following the rules that you bastards set down.
The first new coal mine for 30 years in Whitehaven in Cumbria gets the go-ahead from the government. Climate campaigners do not dig it, but some local people really do.
Well, I think you just have to look up and down King Street to see that needs a bit of investment.
Yeah.
The problem is you can get investment with green tech, and it's quite funny that the first people they got to ask are someone who's elderly and who's used to that kind of stuff. You know, I grew up with coal. Why? Fuck off. We're not back in the fucking 60s, 70s and 80s. This is the 21st century, not the 20th.
All the empty shops.
And yes, that's kind of ironic coming from someone who dresses like they're from the 16th, 17th century, or maybe before, but I don't care. Like, it doesn't matter how I dress. And whilst me being pagan means I believe in holding some things, it is not actually anathemas to also believe in cultural evolution, social evolution, technological evolution.
It used to be a really thriving place.
Again, I don't really want to be disparaging towards old people, but again, they're asking people who remember what it was like when they were younger. It's a point of view that is sympathetic but very biased, which means it's I don't believe it's correct in the current context. And it's just, this high street was booming when I was a kid, and when it was investment and we had the coal mines and stuff. Yeah, it might have been. And you could have it again, just move to a different tech. Crying out loud.
Meanwhile, a blood-curdling warning about the threat to nature from the boss of the UN.
Humanity has become a weapon of mass extinction. We are treating nature like a toilet.
And is this zinger the conclusive proof that Keir Starmer is much more ruthless than you first thought?
His backbenchers threatened him. And as always, the blancmange Prime Minister wobbled.
I'm sorry. Ruthless. I mean, don't get me wrong. This is a word I've used about Starmer before, but like using that particular example.
And we'll talk about people's favourite desserts later on. But first of all, we're going to have a little bit of respite from all of that, and we're going to listen to some of The Nutcracker by Tchaikovsky.
Why? I'm sorry, we're not.
No, that's not because our regular teacher, Joe Coburn, is off and I'm the supply teacher and we're watching a video today. It's because the Ukrainian culture minister has written a piece in The Guardian where he says that arts institutions in Ukraine's allies should pause performances by Russian composers like Tchaikovsky, and that would keep Vladimir Putin on his toes.
I suppose Ukraine is trying to fight back on the culture war that Putin started here. So
ballet reference there. So
I mean, there is an argument to say why engage, but he's been so ruthless on it.
And basically, it's a cultural boycott he's proposing. Jenny, will you be?
That's what I mean. Like I can see why Zelensky would go down this route. I mean, it's mockery, and he was a comedian that mocked who was in power. I can see where he's going with that.
Picking up your tickets for the Nutcracker?
Well, I think I could actually personally live without Tchaikovsky probably for the rest of my life, but that might say more about me and my lack of cultural education. But I mean, there is a serious point here about sporting events and about culture. And the Labour Party feels that actually we should be excluding Russia from significant sporting events because the fact is that Putin, glorifies in these moments. And
unfortunately, yeah, and see, I don't. I'm not anti-Russian. I can be a bit prejudiced sometimes. I openly prejudiced sometimes. I admit that, but often it's against the Americans, or my own people. Well, I say my own people, the English, British, but I'm not. It's to me, it's more about culture, and when it comes to religion, that's where I get really anti shit. I'm anti-racism, anti-sexism. I don't believe in either. I just don't like seeing it. To me, it's just a form of bullying, and I can't stand it. However, ripping into people when they fucking deserve it, I don't believe is actually bullying. It's actually people being forced to hear the home truths, because so many people go through their lives just not hearing it, or if they hear it, just live in denial about themselves. It's ridiculous. And yes, that sounds a bit pretentious of me, but I don't care. I literally don't care at this point. So I get this, but at the same time, there's a part of me that feels a bit like, whilst this is sticking the craw of Putin, does this not help push the Russian citizenry further away from us? If we reinforce their fears about us, how does that help? That's all I'm trying to say there.
Uses them to enhance his standing in Russia and on the world stage, and we should not be allowing them that opportunity. Sad as it is for those who would like to compete, sometimes you do need to take these battles into those arenas too.
But Robin, does it really make a difference?
I don't think banning Tchaikovsky would. I mean, I think there's a question about what you can do which has leverage on the Russian regime, the current Russian regime. I think it's absolutely fair enough to look at things that do that. I think we've got to remember that some of the culture from previous Russian regimes, I think, has nothing to do with that. And so in that respect, I think it will probably be going too far to say that we should be boycotting Tchaikovsky. I have a 4-year-old daughter who's very passionate about ballet, and
So
although
are you going?
she's only ever seen it on YouTube so far.
Yeah.
But actually, I think it's good to have that breadth of culture available to children and young and old alike. I do think, though, there's a serious point about how we can make sure that Russia feels its international isolation, and it's absolutely right that we should be pushing on sanctions. We should be looking at modern-day sporting events and other fora in which we should absolutely be making sure they feel the pressure.
But Arlene, I mean, where would this stop, though? I mean, what if you're...
That's what I mean. I don't know. I'm kind of caught between the Tory and the Labour one, and the Labour MP on this one. Hang on. But yeah, with Russia, I'm a bit stuck between the two.
planning to read War and Peace over the Christmas holidays? Like, should we not be doing that?
Well, not Putin, but the Russian citizenry, because not all of them believe in this war. Fucking special military operation. Fuck's sake.
That's what you're getting at.
I don't agree with cutting out Russian culture from society. I mean, I think that would be wrong. And I think it's wrong not only for us here in the UK, but for all of those people who live in Russia under this regime. I've always said it's the ordinary people of Russia who are suffering. It's the ordinary people of Ukraine who are suffering. And our answer should not be, we're going to cut off your culture. I think there are other ways in which we need...
That's what I mean. I hate to agree with Arlene Foster, for fuck's sake, and a Tory, but I think going all out against Russian culture as a whole might be a bit much. Again, it's not like I don't see the other side of the argument, because I do. I feel that if we're supposed to be this multicultural society, we're being a bit hypocritical. Let me know what you think.
To, as you say, Robin, isolate the Russian regime, but cutting off culture is not the way.
George, I reckon you've probably done a few boycotts in your life. Do they actually work? And when you think back to something that you didn't do a few years ago, did it make any difference?
Well, some economic boycotts can work, but cultural boycotts, I mean, it's too ridiculous. Look, our argument is with Putin, it's with his illegal war of aggression. It's not with Tchaikovsky, it is not with Tolstoy. And you demean and devalue the crucial cause of Ukrainian sovereignty by spreading the net in this way. I mean, it always gets ridiculous. You know, you think of the renaming of German shepherds as Alsatians in the First World War, or in the Second World War in the US, they started calling sauerkraut liberty cabbage, and check this, German measles, liberty measles. Yeah. Whoa, I got liberty measles, hooray!
Yeah. I mean, we've all been...
I didn't know that last bit. I don't know why I knew about the sauerkraut one, but I did not know that last bit. Like, what? See, this is why this is where the Americans weird me out. And again, it's cultural, and it's a cultural shock to me. It just, what's wrong with you guys? The fuck?
Things can have the funny side of this, and I'm as much to blame for that too. But there is a serious point, which is that the Ukrainian culture minister is making, is that Putin is trying to erase Ukrainian culture in Russia. So actually, this is a battlefield now. It's not just jokes about that.
No, but you don't go down. You don't.
Yeah, like I said, I did make the point of the culture side of things is something that Putin actually started the argument on. You know, right at the beginning of this, the preceding this, he did this whole monologue on how the Ukraine isn't even a sovereign state. Bastard. He started this, so I get that there's an element if you don't start an argument, you can't finish. But at the same time, do we treat Russia as a whole in the same way we treat Putin? It's a question. Let me know.
Go lower then. If somebody is going low and attacking your culture, you don't say, well, in retaliation, I'm going to cut off your culture. I think that is the wrong way to go, and we should be bigger than that. But there are other ways in which we...
Coming from the former... I think this is rather hypocritical coming from the former DUP leader. Oh.
We can isolate Putin.
I mean, hang on. I've got to... Let me just double check myself on this. Just waiting for my Google to catch up. Yeah, DUP. Yeah, I think it's rather hypocritical coming from the DUP to if you don't do this, we're not going to do that. Like, really? Really? Did you just say that? It's to me, it's just like the Christians complaining about their minority status. It's just what are you talking about? Shut up.
And we should be certainly looking at that, and we should still be talking about the war in Ukraine, because sometimes I think people get a bit frustrated and fed up listening about the war in Ukraine. The fact is, it's still going on, and it needs to be at the forefront of everybody's minds, particularly at this time of the year when it's so very cold.
Yeah, I feel I should maybe look at some Ukrainian ballets on YouTube. Maybe your daughter can send me some links. Right, okay, let's look at the front pages of today's papers, and they're all dominated by the strikes, because it looks like there will be at least one strike in a sector of the economy every day until Christmas. Let's see how the papers have been treating this. First of all, we can look at the Daily Mail. They're saying it's beginning to look a lot like an Xmas general strike. In other words, all these strikes are kind of merging into one.
Pretty
The
much.
Times is focusing on a new strike that we heard about last night, which is Border Force staff at
I'm pretty
British
sure.
airports who are...
I'm not sure who explained this for me. I think it was either Maximilian Robespierre pointed this out, or I think it actually might have been Phil from A Different Bias, you know. But with what the Tories did in clamping down on unions with the law, I think it's, you can't strike in sympathy with another bunch of strikers. So I think that's sort of how she wants to deal with how they want to deal with, you know, how they've dealt with the whole general strike problem. So whilst essentially this is a general strike, and well, pretty much, like, they can't actually call it one because they can't. If I remember how this was explained to me, the unions in Britain now, at least in England, can't unify. The unions can't unify, if that makes sense, and become a general strike. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure this was explained to me. This was explained by either Max or Phil from A Different Bias.
Not going to go to work around about Christmas, which could affect people who are trying to get away on a break or going to see their families. And the Daily Telegraph has gone with the angle about the military being asked to come in and fill the gaps, and some of the military personnel not being happy because it means that they miss their Christmases. But then The Sun, their political editor Harry Cole, has zoomed in on the government response with this headline saying PM will ban ambulance drivers and firefighters from striking under, quote,
Want help
tough
under
That's
this.
a reference to this idea that's been around for a while, that you could put in law kind of minimum levels of service that have to be provided, and people on strike would not be able to go below that level. And it looks like the government is thinking about extending that to some other places. Previously, they'd only talked about doing that in the transport sector. Now, Robin, there are so many strikes. The list is actually quite extraordinary when you see it all written down in one place. The idea of legislating for minimum levels of service, isn't that kind of like reinforcing the stable door after all the horses have bolted?
Well, I think, first of all, no one wants to see these strikes go ahead. I think it's important that there are negotiations and there are attempts to reach agreement on these things. I think to a large extent, though, the government has engaged on many of the issues that the unions are raising. If I look at my area as chairman of the Education Select Committee, we had a very clear demand for the unions that £2 billion was needed next year and the year after for the sector. That has now been provided as a result of the autumn statement, and yet they're still balloting to strike. I think in those circumstances, it's absolutely...
Right, well, the problem is, mate, is that the guru that Boris brought in said that what the whole education sector needed was about 15.5 billion. So 2 does not cut it. I think what the 2 was about, scraping by, because you cunts keep constantly talking about living within our means, as you've been saying for the last 12 years.
Absolutely right for the government to look at what is the minimum service that needs to be provided. How do we make sure that children who have missed out on so much as a result of the COVID lockdowns don't miss out further on their vital education? You can only be educated once. So in that space, I do think it is worth exploring, and I questioned the Secretary of State yesterday on contingency measures that the government today. I don't think it necessarily requires new legislation in that space. But I think when we're talking about public safety, of course it is the case that the police and the armed forces aren't able to strike. It always has been and has been in law for a long time. I don't think it's unreasonable actually to look at what may be required to keep vital services functioning over this period. I hope it won't be necessary, because I hope these things can be resolved through negotiation. And I would always urge colleagues in government to engage first and seek to avoid strikes.
You bring up the teachers. Teachers in Scotland are on strike today. You mentioned the ballot for teachers elsewhere. Do you think when the government's looking at this idea of legislation for minimum service levels, schools should be in there too? It shouldn't just be transport, ambulances, firefighters?
Well, I think we...
You're taking away the democratic right to withdraw their labour for unfair treatment. Just because they are public service workers does not mean that they can be treated like fucking slaves. And not only that, but they put their own contingencies into place. So I'm not sure why this legislation is needed. Apart from to be aggressive to the unions and to workers.
We need to look at how we keep schools open. I think it's absolutely vital. It's something my predecessor as chair of the Select Committee sort of wanted to make sure that there were tougher laws against schools ever being closed again after the lessons of what we saw during COVID. I think he had a very good point in that. And even having been on the receiving end of it as a minister, I felt he had a fair point.
Just to be clear, you would advise ministers consider...
I don't think legislation is necessarily the solution to this. I think proper contingency planning, working with schools to make sure that they can have the core staff in place to enable children to be able to continue to come in, it is probably sufficient.
What the fuck is this? A reasonable Tory? Colour me impressed.
In that space, but of course what we do need to make sure is recognise what are vital public services and how can we keep them going.
Okay, George?
Well, this is a profoundly illiberal government. It's already introduced the most repressive anti-protest laws.
I suppose he's from The Guardian. George Monbiot? I don't know. Interesting. I don't know about this dude. I might have to read up again on this guy. I think I've seen his face before. Don't know why. Right now. Interesting. The Tory's sounding weirdly fucking reasonable. I mean, he still won't rule legislation out because it's Tory, but he sounded a lot more reasonable than a lot of the other Tories that I've been listening to speak about this situation, which is something I've got to admit.
Of the modern era, and now it wants severely to curtail the right to strike. Yeah, there are always two sides in an industrial dispute, and one side has been winning its class war for years and years now, and that is the bosses, capital, the big corporations, and indeed the government crushing public services and crushing terms and conditions for workers within public services. And if you want to resolve industrial action, and if you want to ensure that people don't go on strike, you give them decent wages and decent terms and conditions. And what we've seen is this government seeming quite deliberately to be stoking industrial action, as we've seen with the railways. It introduced the idea of driver-only trains at the last minute, almost as if it were trying to spike any resolution of that action. It thrives on chaos.
This is what I mean. This guy's been saying what I was saying earlier. Tories keep treating the unions like they're their rivals, like they're the enemy. Fucking bastards. What? Got my girly.
Chaos. It thrives on dysfunction. It wants to be seen performatively to be beating up its class enemies. And while that might play well with some of its base and some of its right-wing backbenchers, it's a disaster for the country.
Robin, how do you reply to that claim?
Simply don't recognise that picture. If we look at our public sector workers, they tend to be better paid than their equivalents in the private sector. We have terms and conditions which are negotiated with the unions. I was talking only yesterday to representatives of the National Education Union about the well-being strategy which the Department of Education have put in place in consultation with them. So
Robin,
I think that's a very misleading picture that's being painted, particularly when it comes to
how do you explain
services.
the Transport Secretary's refusal to answer the question of whether they deliberately introduced this issue of driver-only trains in order to derail, so to speak,
driver-only trains have
the
been something which has
negotiations?
been in technology over a very long period of time. They came into place on the DLR under the last Labour
So
government.
why was it thrown in at the last moment?
I don't think it was. I think this is something which has been a very long time coming in the transport sector. I think in that case you're talking about something which is entirely different, in that you're talking about workers who are working for private sector companies who are negotiating with their employers.
They derailed the negotiations which would have brought this industrial action to an end.
I'm not cited on that detail, but what I would say is that I think government needs to negotiate.
Right, you two are helping the programme's timetable slipping. So, Jenny, if these minimum service levels are legislated for, would the Labour government unwrap them on the first day in office?
They're not going to do anything to help this situation. The government's incompetent. It has deliberately caused this problem. Knowingly, over the summer, the then Transport Secretary decided...
Well, no, the negotiations are between the train companies.
No, he decided it was really good politics for the Tory party to make this situation worse. He deliberately went out and aggravated it to get to where we are now. Now we've got to where we are. The new Transport Secretary admitted yesterday morning that actually this legislation isn't going to do anything to solve the problems that we're facing now and that are causing massive disruption and heartache for a lot of families who really wanted to be together this Christmas.
Okay, so that's a critique of the government and the current situation.
The situation is you've got to negotiate. It's wrong that the Health Secretary didn't sit down with the nurses' unions on day one and say, where do we go from here? You know, the strikes are a symptom of something that's been going very badly wrong for many, many years. And this most recent incarnation of the Tory party is probably the most incompetent and provocative we've had, and they have made it worse. You are never going to get
Robin
anywhere.
is obviously shaking his head at that.
Robin's had a lot to say, but actually, I think in his heart of hearts, Robin knows this government is not functioning, is making this worse. And we're not going to get any solution to this by this kind of grandstanding, we're going to pass a law. Have you not noticed the shortages that there already are in the health service? The low numbers of people coming in to become teachers. You know, what is going to happen if you put these kind of draconian rules in place? You're going to make that worse as well. The services are going to suffer. And in the end, it will be kids and people who need treatment in the hospitals that pay the price for this.
So Labour have said they would repeal some...
So I just wanted to let her speak then, because there was no reason to interrupt her. Yeah, pretty much. Just bang on every time on that one. Rishi Sunak doesn't have the authority that he think that some people are trying to portray that he does. And not only that, but as I said, the Tories can't seem to get themselves out of the 80s. Like, this is... And not only that, this is fucking nurses. Nurses! They've never done that. Where are you going? It's ridiculous. What are you up to? They've never gone on strike. Yes, different NHS staff have gone on strike in the past, but I'm pretty sure nurses have not. This is why unions are needed, to challenge the government when it needs to be challenged. There are a lot of people that seem to need to understand the fact that power is not absolute, especially today. We're not in an absolute power system, and it's ridiculous to continue to believe otherwise. I do apologise, I need to quickly dart off again.
Some previous trade union legislation
work.
introduced by the government, but you're not saying what you would do with this minimum.
It doesn't work.
Right.
You remember that under a Labour government for 13 years, we didn't have these strikes. It just didn't happen.
But we didn't have inflation at 11%.
No, but inflation at 11% is not caused by postmen getting a pay rise, is it? We didn't have this. And the reason we didn't, and it's not that there weren't problems, it's not that those trade unions thought that the Blair government was great at every step of the way. Believe me, they did not. There were issues. But they've talked about it. There was negotiation. You had a government that saw it as its job to keep these services going and to keep the schools open and to keep people getting treated in hospitals.
What we saw the last time we saw these kinds of inflationary pressures in the 1970s is a Conservative government that had difficulties with strikes, and then a Labour government that had much greater difficulties with strikes.
Sake.
So people need to realise that the kind of pressures that we're seeing would not necessarily go away, vanish magically overnight under a Labour government. In many respects, they might intensify.
But
so it is important that government has the tools at its disposal to keep public services running.
You know that. I know you.
I like how he just backed up what I said earlier about the Tories being in charge of the first part of the 70s, and he's there saying that there were strikes. It doesn't mean that Labour made it worse, necessarily. I think the unions didn't help on that one.
You know this. Your party has caused this situation. Look at where mortgage rates are. Look at the cost of living. Look at what's happened to pay.
Okay, well, you know what? Let's get Arlene to look at that, because you're out of office now. You also had to deal with some disputes when you were in office. Now that now you've got, well, I was going to say particularly Labour disputes, and plenty of others as well.
Yeah.
Now that you've got a bit more of a distance from all of this and a bit more of a bird's eye view, I mean, what's the answer?
It's interesting to hear George talk about grandstanding from the government. I see grandstanding from both sides, actually, because Nick Lynch, for example, promised that there wouldn't be, from the RMT, that they would not interfere with Christmas, and now we're reading all of these stories about people who can't be with their family.
Yeah, but it's not just Mick Lynch, is it? Like, it's all very well and good, like picking on Mick Lynch and the RMT, but it's not just the railways that are striking over Geola. And from winter solstice onwards,
family at Christmas, and don't forget there are many families that are separated, children living with their mums, they're going to see their dads at Christmas and what have you. That's not going to happen now because this is all come about. So there's a real imperative to sort this out for ordinary people, actually, and instead of the grandstanding.
And what do you think? Who do you think these strikers are? You fucking twat.
on both sides, and that is what I'm saying from both sides. There's a real need to get down and get it sorted.
And George, you said there's two sides in this. There's the bosses and the capitalists, and then there's the poor workers. What isn't there a third side, which is actually the people that need to fly off to see their family or get the train to work? Don't they have rights to do that too?
Well, they do. We all got rights to good services, but our public services have been undermined systematically now for a very long time, well, for 12 years to be precise, and they are suffering grievously, and the workers are suffering on those services, and the customers...
People aren't suffering a bad train service because of cuts. They're suffering a bad train service because the trains aren't running.
Actually, no, actually, people are suffering.
I'm sorry. What did this cunt just fucking say? There are definitely members of the BBC who are not unbiased. Definitely. I mean, yes, this is fucking obvious, but still.
A bad train service.
In addition to that, yeah, okay.
And part of what the strike is about the terms and conditions which affect both the workers and the customers on the train services, where we have this privatised service, money is being sucked out of it. We're not seeing the investment we need to be seeing.
Again, one of the things that drives me mad is that the private companies all said they'd make this shit better, and they haven't. They just pulled them. They're just pulling the money in right at the top. It's stupid.
We're seeing terms and conditions for workers cut at the same time as terms and conditions for customers are cut.
But I do think there's a need for reform in all institutions, and I think that's part of the difficulty here. When you have some unions who are saying, no, we're not going to have any reform, then the difficulty with that is you're going to have to keep putting more and more government money in to have a service. And that's just not efficient, and it's not the right way to run things either. So I think this idea from unions, some unions, not all, some unions, that there can't be any reform and there can't be any redundancies, and we just need more.
See, if she's trying to reference McLean, she's not saying there doesn't need to be reform. The problem is it's the way that they want to do it. That's the problem. It's a case of working with the unions and the railway railway staff to work out how to make things more, to reform it, to make it more efficient, to make it work better for the staff and for the customers. However, the government don't want to know.
More money is not going to land either. They're not going to land either.
The starting point would be that you nationalise the service and you make it a service which actually works for the people of this country rather than for a few foreign corporations.
Fucking yes.
So we're currently creaming off.
Okay, so the services we're talking about are already nationalised. We're talking about strikes affecting. So there's clearly nationalisation is not the solution to this challenge.
Are you talking about the NHS?
When you're talking about health, when you're talking about other areas, these are nationalised.
But we weren't talking about that. We were talking about the railway. It is. But the reason why the nationalised part is striking is because you treat them like crap.
Right, so you're talking about nationalisation, you're taking us back to the 70s. They're also going a bit back to the future in Whitehaven in Cumbria because they're going to get their first new coal mine in more than 3 decades. Now, it's not a coal mine to dig coal out the ground to then put in a power station or someone's fire. It's what's called coal.
We don't know that. Not necessarily. And the majority of it is going to be exported because our industry doesn't want it.
Coking coal, so it's to use in the metals industry, and it's been incredibly controversial because Michael Gove finally approved it last night as the Levelling Up Secretary. He's kind of like the final bit of the planning process, and this decision had been delayed loads and loads and loads of times. You can see it's made the front page of The Guardian. The way they described it is that's Michael Gove ignoring climate warnings to approve this first coal mine in 30 years. George, what do you reckon?
It's so crazy. I mean, here we are, just come out of the climate summit in Egypt, which was a disaster because it did not lead to leaving fossil fuels in the ground, which is the one thing we have to do. This coal mine is providing coking coal for the steel industry, which does not want it. We have British Steel, we have individual steel manufacturers saying there's going to be no market for this here because it's high sulfur, and in fact, steel manufacturers are now moving over to electric arc, which doesn't require coal burning at all. On the jobs issue, well, you know, if you want to create jobs, get our homes insulated. There's a desperate need for that, and I'm sure many people on this cold day are feeling it right now. You know, we could generate huge amounts of jobs because insulation is high labour, low capital, whereas this coal mining is high capital, low labour. You know, it won't employ many people. In fact, it probably won't employ anyone at all because by the time it's ready to start producing coal, it will be a stranded asset. So here's the government yet again playing to the worst instincts and the worst parts of its backbenches, the kind of people who brought us Brexit. Thanks for that, guys. Now bringing us the ripping up of our climate commitments and vast amounts of money, of spoil heaps, of wastage, of blight, just to produce something which probably isn't going anywhere.
Well, on the jobs picture, it's perceived very differently, as you might imagine, by the Conservative leader of the local borough council, who is David Moore.
Not a single green job has been created yet that I'm aware of here in Copeland. But this is going to create us.
Why don't you track the investment, Bellend?
$500 jobs almost immediately, 1,500 in the supply chain. And I think people have to understand that mining is very different now. So the type of skills they're looking for is those young people out there that are now playing on their PlayStations and Xboxes. Those are the type of skills you need to drive a mining machine today. So it's about the opportunities for our young people as well as the wider community.
So, Robin, just explain to us how this is consistent with the UK's climate change goals.
Well, I think crucially, we have exited coal for power completely, and we are one of the leading countries in Europe when it comes to that, unlike countries like Germany, which are importing coal from Poland, some of the dirtiest coal in Europe, and burning it.
But this coal will still be burned.
This coal will be used as part of the steelmaking process, and the alternative to that, and I agree with George, but in the long run, we want all our steelmaking process to move towards...
They've already moving over to it. Like, literally.
Arc furnaces, or possibly the use of hydrogen as well. I think there are ways of doing this in the future. But in the short term, the alternative to that is importing coal from the other side of the world, bringing it in from other countries, which will mean shipping it at enormous environmental cost as well as financial cost, and making our steel industry fundamental.
85% of it's going to be for export. Most of it's going to be for export. And how is that going to be? Shit, Bellend.
Mentally less competitive. If we do that, we will be importing the steel from China. We will be importing it from third countries.
Oh, I see. So
which has an enormous environmental footprint.
So this is net zero. This coal is net zero because we're going to send it to other countries to burn.
No, this coal can reduce the overall environmental footprint of our steel industry by.
They just won't. They won't listen. Leave the coal in the ground. Just leave it.
Not relying on more expensive and more environmentally expensive imports from elsewhere.
This coal is going to be exported, Robin. You're just talking rubbish. This coal is not for the domestic market. Even in the plans for this mine, 83% of the coal is going to be exported.
But there is demand.
So even if there were any basis for this argument you're making at all, which there isn't, because the transport aspect of coal is tiny by comparison to the fossil fuels produced by burning it. But even if there were, it is still false because this coal is for export. Why are you telling us this rubbish?
The coal will be burned whether or not we produce it or whether other countries produce it. What it means is that the European market can actually run this.
It doesn't mean we need to add to it, you fucking dick.
Than shipping the stuff from around the world.
Well, no one in Europe
huge
wants
environmental
it
footprint.
It's too high sulfur for Europe. You can't sell it in Europe. It's going to go out.
It's not going to go to Europe. It's going to go to other countries, probably less scrupulous countries. Oh, what a shock. The Tories are going to sell to less scrupulous countries.
The reality of the approach which is being suggested by people like George is that it will result in more steel being imported from higher polluting countries on the far side of the world. I don't think that's the solution. I think we need to maintain our domestic steel.
Our own steel industry doesn't want it. Therefore, the evidence that says they are already moving to electric arc. He's talking crap.
And we absolutely need to incentivise it to move towards greener technologies
I need to
over
murder
time.
my
But in the
neighbour before
meantime, I do
someone
think
else
this is a
does.
Well, it's
sensible
getting very, very violent
approach.
imagery there. Jenny, would a Labour government, you can see the theme to my questions to you,
Yes, thank you very much.
shut down this coal mine?
I don't think the coal mine will be up and running and viable by the time of the next general election. I don't think anybody is claiming that. If I thought, like, I come from the northeast of England, right? So communities around me, it's steel, it's coal. I get this. If I thought, and I agree with what George has said, obviously, about climate, but if I honestly thought that this was the solution for the economy of Whitehaven and Cumbria, and this was going to bring 500 really good, well-paid jobs to that community, I would have to really look at my conscience over this. But I just don't believe it. I just don't believe it. Because if you look at what's happening in steel and any other industry, the need for coal is going down and down and down. So why aren't we saying to Cumbria, you can have your modular reactor, so we're reinvesting in nuclear for them. Why aren't we saying we want to invest in hydrogen, in battery, energy storage? Why aren't we investing in those jobs? Because that council leader, he's welcoming that mine because he's got one job, and that's to look after that community. And he says, not a single green job, right? So I want to be able to say to him, you're not going to get these green jobs in this sort of airy-fairy, 10 years' time, we might find you some lovely jobs in wind power. We need to be able to say to him, you're going to get these jobs in this community, to employ this people. We're going to work with your universities and your colleges and your schools to make sure your local population are the people who are going to get the benefit of these jobs.
Education.
We need to work together and get that plan delivered. Because this is not going to be the solution for West Cumbria.
This is
I don't
working.
think anybody believes it is.
Once again, this is the Tories not being able to come out of the 20th century. It just is.
I thought it was, I might take a different view of this, but those jobs are not what they're being sold as today.
So if it's not up and running by the next time there's a Labour government, then what, you stop it being built, or
what will be there in 2 years' time? I don't think anyone's saying they're going to be taking coal out the ground. There's going to be a market for it. There's going to be hundreds of jobs dependent on that activity. If that was the situation, obviously we'd have to look at it. But that's not what anyone's claiming.
The reason why Labour used to represent these communities and now they don't any longer, and Conservatives are being elected there, is because Labour didn't deliver those jobs.
Because there was a promise of levelling up from the Tory party. Where is it? Where are those bus routes?
Fucking boom! Shut the fuck up, Tory.
Where's those train services?
Well, you know what? Let's park that. If you park on the bus
I live in the northeast, and I know exactly what was said in that election, and I know exactly what the Labour Party was offering at the time as well.
Let's press pause on that discussion, because I want to keep it focused on the environment and green issues. Because if you loved COP27, as George was referring to the climate change conference a minute ago, you're going to love COP15, which is happening in Canada right now, and it's kind of like the little brother or sister, or I don't know, shorter twin of the climate change conference, and it's about biodiversity. And it got started yesterday with this
I don't think I've heard of that one. COP15? I'll have to have a look. I've got to admit, it's not something, not one I'm actually familiar with.
quite worrying warning from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres.
Ecosystems have become playthings of profit. With our bottomless appetite for unchecked and unequal economic growth, humanity has become a weapon of mass extinction. We are treating nature like a toilet, and ultimately, we are committing suicide by proxy.
Right, some very powerful images. Let's speak now to our client.
Actually, I'd like the words he used there. That's pretty good from Antonio Guterres.
Climate change editor Justin Rolat, who joins us down the line. Hi, Justin.
Hiya.
Biodiversity, to me, it's a bit of a jargon word. What actually is it, and how does it fit into just the whole kind of climate crisis thing?
I'm not sure that I buy that biodiversity is so complicated. Biodiversity just means the range of species on Earth, be they animals, plants, fungi, microorganisms, bacteria. It's life on Earth. It's as simple as that. It really isn't very complicated. There is a crisis in biodiversity. We We know that. You can see the decline of wild populations of vertebrate animals, for example, are down almost 70% since.
There is some correlation with just before a major mass extinction. If you look at the biodiversity leading up to it, and then the biodiversity just before, there's a discrepancy there usually. And I'm not saying that correlation equals causation here. I'm not saying that basically you see, and not only that, but you start seeing, for example, in the KPG, just before the KPG extinction, you got the more advanced forms of life, of those of the lineages of dinosaurs and other life forms that are living at the time. Yes, there were some that were just starting out that died off, and there were some that's just starting out that lived through it. But the more advanced, most of the more advanced forms wiped out, and basically you had to start again from scratch for many different biomes. And it's not just the KPG extinction either. You know, the Permian Triassic extinction event. You know, synapsids have gotten to a point where they were tank-like synapsids, gorgonopsids, scoping out the landscape. But the biodiversity had shrunk dramatically. And I wonder, is our species, and where the advancement we're at, is that another only this time we are actually having to cause the extinction?
1970s, a catastrophic decline. The UN estimates about 1 million species are at risk of extinction.
Sorry, it's one reason I can't stand climate change deniers. The simple fact is, if you look into the paleontological record, you can see climate change, drastic climate change throughout Earth's history. So to say that it doesn't happen is bullshit, quite literally. And to say it doesn't have any effect on life on Earth is also quite literally bullshit.
Scientists look at the pattern of extinction and say this is comparable, if not even.
Just confirmed everything I just said.
Even faster than some of the great extinction events that happened in our distant evolutionary past. Some of which,
whilst he's not coming from the same, quite the same angle, like I said, I just thought it makes you think that, is it that a species gets more advanced as things get harder? Or there's a period of ease and then things get drastically harder? I don't know.
Which saw 90% of all species on Earth being wiped out. So the fear is we're going to face another, like if climate change wasn't worrying enough, we face another terrible crisis on Earth, which is a crisis of biodiversity. Why is it important? Because the variety of species on Earth, the web of life, if you like, supports everything on Earth. All life on Earth is supported by other life on Earth. We lose that. We lose everything. We lose the clean air, clean water. We lose, what it is to have a living Earth. So it could not be more important. It really couldn't.
Justin, thank you very much for telling me off. I'm going to compliment your very on-brand green kitchen tiles in return.
We haven't got the central. I just want to explain. I'm wearing a fleece because we haven't turned our heating on. In true, living the story, fashion, we still haven't got our heating on, so it's a little bit chilly in our house.
Very Newsnight circa 2008. In terms of trade-offs and action that's required, I mean, what should we as citizens be doing less of or more of to help solve the biodiversity crisis?
What should we be doing as citizens? We should be more careful about what we buy and where it comes from. But I mean, what is happening in Montreal is an attempt to get the nations of the world, the countries of the world together. 196 countries are represented. I mean, we talk down these these big international meetings, but they are quite extraordinary examples of kind of humanity coming together to solve these really tricky problems. They aren't always as ambitious as we hope. That was certainly true of COP27, but they are like a step in the right direction.
COP26.
We really shouldn't undermine them. It's an extraordinary thing that's happening. So 196 countries coming together to try and agree a series of targets. It's much more.
I do like that this has happened not long after the last one with the. Whilst you could go with the cynical view of they're doing it because of the bad show, the last one, they're doing it again to try and make a show that they're making more of an effort, but I do think that genuinely you could see the side of the result of COP27 and COP26 were utter shite. Like, we need to really iron something out. So, could it be? I don't know. Like I said, I don't know much about I don't think I've even heard of it before. So,
Complications in climate change, which is complicated enough. They've got 4 key goals and then a series of, I think it's 23 separate targets. But the bottom line is this: what they're trying to do is halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity by 2030, which is hugely ambitious. There's a new phrase, a bit like net zero. They talk about nature positive, halting the loss and beginning the reversal of the loss of biodiversity. So that's the buzzword, nature positive. We want the world to be nature positive. How are they going to do that? Well, they're talking about protected areas, so increasing 30% of land and sea protected by 2030. Very ambitious, but some optimism that will be achieved. And then there'll be targets to prevent extinctions, to support wildlife populations around the world, restore habitat, that kind of thing. And they're all an effort to kind of cut subsidies that are damaging for nature, tackle drivers of biodiversity loss like deforestation and pollution. You get the I could go on.
Yes.
And then there'll be a big resource, a big finance discussion, which there always is. How is the developed world going to help the developing world? Which are the kind of, if you like, the remaining biodiversity superpowers, if you like? How do they get the resources they need to protect these areas and support biodiversity? Huge, complex negotiations. But look, there is some optimism that we may come to an agreement. There's a kind of constellation of forces, unique moment that means that it might actually be a really significant decision.
That would be interesting.
Justin, thank you very much, and thank you to your scarf as well. Arlene, I mean, as a politician, you can probably get people to care about green jobs. It must be quite hard to get people to care about plants and animals in countries that might never go to.
Well, you know what, I'm going to agree with you and not agree with Justin. I think biodiversity is a word that's not really understood by children, by young people, the importance of it, the need to have biodiversity in nature. And therefore, I think we do need to break down some of our language sometimes, because we're talking here in a studio, we know what biodiversity is, but it's about time that we try to help other people understand that. And for me, it's about getting out into nature, to understanding why it's important to have all of those different species, and indeed planting more trees. So if I can go back to something which I really think was a fabulous initiative, the Queen's Green Canopy, encouraging people to plant more trees. So it's local actions for me in biodiversity. That's what's important. And I think organisations and leadership that was given by the royal family, and indeed by uniformed organisations like the Guides and Scouts, getting out into nature, getting into understanding it is really, really important.
Yeah, George, I mean, we love the natural world in this country, but have you been able to link that to a challenge called biodiversity loss?
There's a real disconnect, a real failure. I mean, if you look at National Trust, RSPB, Wildlife Trust, they've got 8 million members between them, and yet this is one of the most nature-depleted countries on Earth. On paper, we've got 28% of our land protected, but a scientific study shows that only 5% of it reaches the international standard of protected areas. At sea, you've got these vast marine protected areas, but they're just lines on a map, and trawlers can go straight through and rip them all apart. And so we like to tell ourselves that we're a nation of nature lovers, and we like to tick all the boxes, but actually when it comes to it, we are just not protecting our own wildlife and our own ecosystems. And we can't do this by ourselves. It is important to do all the things that Arlene is talking about, but those are really tiny by comparison to what governments can and should be doing. They should be making our protected areas genuine protected areas, rewilding them, restoring nature on a massive scale, which not only would prevent the sixth great extinction, but also draw down much of the carbon dioxide that's already been released into the atmosphere. And we're going to do that, we're going to need to do that as well.
Robin, there seems to have been a bit of toing and froing within the government about this idea of farmers conserving the natural world. Is the government doing enough, or have they kind of put all the focus on climate change and ignored this bit?
No, I think this is an important priority for the government. I think we have targets in law to reduce nature depletion and start improving the recovery of nature. I think that is an important start. But actually, I don't disagree with George in terms of thinking we can go further, particularly on marine protected zones. I think it's important that we do that. It's important we look at recovering, for instance, peatlands, which both in England and Northern Ireland, there are opportunities to do that, which are huge carbon source. I also think when it comes to farming policy, there's always a difficult balance to strike between incentivising food production and looking at food security, which particularly in the current environment is important, but also in protecting the environment. And I've been lobbying ministers on behalf of my local wildlife trust to talk more about the elm scheme to make sure that we have an incentive to provide hedgerows, which are a really valuable natural habitat. Ministers are listening, and I hope they are acting. I'm not responsible for policy in that space, but I think it is really important. I think the other part, and where I'd agree with Arlene, is I think biodiversity can seem quite a sort of weird scientific term. Children do understand nature, and they want to engage in nature. And one of the great things we've seen in our schools over the last 20 years has been the emergence of the forest schools movement and getting children outside, engaging with that. One of the things I was really pleased to do whilst I was at the Department for Education was approve a new GCSE in natural history. I think that fills a really important gap between that primary school stage and where we have A-level environmental studies and so on and so forth. It allows children to continue to engage with nature.
I wish I had that when I was a kid. I'd have done that. By the time I was doing my GCSEs, the Tories were in charge, and it wasn't there. Could have acted sooner on that, mate.
Take part in field studies and get a better understanding of biodiversity and the importance of
that.
I
suppose, this is cultural evolution. I'm part of the generation of where changes like this were starting to happen, but weren't in, place. The changes weren't in place in time for me to actually have benefit of that.
This is an important agenda. It's one that we need to lean into internationally, and I think the UK can actually be a force for good in this respect.
One of my favourite memories of working on the Daily Politics, the predecessor of this programme, was doing a quiz with Liz Truss when she was Environment Secretary about identifying various leaves. She got every single one right.
I remember.
So she did have some skills. Right, okay, let's talk about something that's going on in the Labour Party. The Labour Party. Don't bring up that lettuce again. There was no brassicas in that quiz. Right, is the lettuce a brassica?
No, it's not.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Right, okay. Let's talk about something that's going on in the Labour Party at the moment. They're selecting their candidates that we'll all be kind of looking at in the next election and deciding whether to vote for them or not. But there have been some complaints from some on the left that they are being excluded from that process or not being treated very fairly. And I think that's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it affects who you're presented with at the ballot box at the next election. But also some people are saying it reveals something about Keir Starmer's leadership. Somebody who cares about this is Andrew Fisher, who was policy chief for the previous Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, and he's here now. Hi, Andrew.
Hi.
Right, what is your concern about what's going on in this process? And just make it easy for us outsiders to understand, if you could.
Sure. So right across the party, as you said, local parties are supposed to be selecting their candidates. But what we found right across the country is that candidates who are perceived to be on the left are being blocked by the Labour Party centrally and not allowed to be put on a ballot before members. And this is not really the kind of pluralistic democratic party that Labour should be and claims to be. It also goes against what Keir Starmer promised in 2020 when he was running to be Labour leader, in that he said he'd make his elections more democratic and that it was local parties who should choose. And yet, time after time, we've seen left candidates blocked on completely spurious grounds. One for liking a tweet by a Green MP, one for liking a tweet by the First Minister of Scotland when she said she had a negative COVID test. Really sort of trumped up charges, and the same scrutiny isn't being put on candidates who are perceived to be more on the right of the party.
What? So that was the only reason that one person got rejected, was because they
it was
liked
certainly
Nick?
given as one of the reasons. I think
One of the reasons. So there could have been other things.
So one of the others, and this person, as it happens, Lauren Townsend in Milton Keynes, has spoken about this herself. So I'll talk about that. She also tweeted something critical of Keir Starmer, disagreeing with him on a policy issue, which of course is fine. Lots of Labour MPs disagree with Keir Starmer on various policy issues. Many of Jenny's colleagues were briefing the press on Sunday in the House of Lords that they didn't want the House of Lords to be abolished, and they thought Keir Starmer was wrong on that. So, we've always welcomed debate within the Labour Party, and what we seem to be having now is a closing down of that debate, especially if it's from people on the left.
Does this really matter to British democracy, or is this just an internal Labour issue?
I think it really does matter to British democracy, because actually you don't get the best candidates if they haven't been subject to the most rigorous process. And actually local people know who is good and who is bad. The best test of who's a good candidate, who's got some skeletons in their closet, is letting local members choose who they want to represent.
I have spoken up for Starmer several times. I'm not going to speak up for him now. I do not agree with this. However, does that mean I'm going to pull my support from the Labour Party? No, because I don't think he's gonna be going down the same line. He's not Tory. For example, people call him a red Tory, but he's not. He's not on the right. He's just towards the centre. It's a bit different. It's more like a Liberal Democrat.
Represent them. They're going to pick the best candidate to win that election. I've voted for people on different wings of the party.
I've also said many times, Corbyn got me into politics. It's Corbyn's politics that got me into politics.
Over the years as a Labour Party member, not just along kind of factional lines or whatever else. It's really important that actually Labour Party gets the best candidates possible in order to scrutinise legislation in the future. And there are some really talented people on the left who unfortunately have been cut out during this process, and it's done Labour damage. We've seen in Stroud, for example, is another one where the leader of the council, the Labour leader of the council, was blocked from standing, saying she wasn't, didn't pass due diligence. This is somebody who's been leading a Labour council with a far more responsibility and powers than a backbench MP would have. And yet they're told they're not fit enough to be an MP. What does that tell the local electors who have, elected this person several times and elected a Labour council? It's ridiculous.
Okay, Jenny, you were a political secretary. I can't remember what the job title was for when you worked with Keir Starmer.
Political secretary.
Yeah, so this was totally in your wheelhouse. This thing that's happening now, is that a Starmer-directed process?
It's not Starmer-directed, but Keir Starmer is a strong leader. Compare him to Rishi Sunak, who's wobbling all over the shop and got called blancmange yesterday. Actually, Keir is
a killer jibe, but anyway.
Well, it's quite apt, I think. But Keir is a strong leader, and he does want the very best candidates to represent the Labour Party and their communities at the next general election. And I make absolutely no apologies for it. With best will in the world with Andrew, we tried it his way between 2015 and 2019, and look what happened. Absolute disaster. So yes, Keir is, there is more grip on this process. Yes, there is. And I think you're seeing some really strong candidates coming through. And I think the next parliamentary Labour Party is going to be an incredibly strong group of people because...
This might have been a big mistake. I'd like to see what Phil from A Different Bias has to say about this particular incident here. I do. I think this is a big mistake from Labour here. Corbyn policies were the actual Corbyn manifesto was very popular amongst voters. It's just the Tories have poisoned everyone against Corbyn himself. Plus, the organisational side of things, the factional nature of the infighting didn't help.
There is this rigour to the process. I'm very proud of it. I think it's good. And I think this is a serious process. You've got to have these kind of this rigorous approach to it.
She sounds very weak. This is horrid. Yeah. This is down point here for Labour.
Letting it go on the way that happened previously, it was just catastrophic.
Let's put that to Andrew. Is this a more ruthless Keir Starmer that your pals are the victim of?
Definitely is a more ruthless one. And when Jenny says there's more grip, that grip is firmly around the throat of the left. And we've seen that time and again. But if we look at Jenny Chapman when she was in charge of that, look at what happened in Hartlepool.
Yeah.
She picked Paul Williams on a long list of one. That was what the party had to choose from. And how did he do? He lost. He also lost having, just after he was selected from that long list of one, misogynistic tweets came out that many of Jenny's colleagues or former colleagues...
Andrew, I'm going to stop you there because this is now maybe getting a little bit too granular, even for our very well-informed viewers.
Absolutely true.
Andrew, you stop there, Jenny, very quickly.
The reason all of that happened is because Keir Starmer said that he did not want people in the Parliamentary Labour Party who'd been found to have behaved in a way that sadly the former candidate in that seat had, who was chosen under the process that Andrew is supporting.
You know what, guys, this is getting too much even for me.
Keir is a very strong leader, and I make no apologies for that.
Andrew, thank you very much. Jenny.
Oh, I'm not sure about that at all. I'm not sure about it. That's gonna hurt quite a lot of people.
Thank you for trying to clear all that up. Arlene, what is the right balance between ruthless and kind of nice?
Well, to try to be in the middle. I think it is
which
important.
the DUP were famous for.
Which we are famous for. You're absolutely right. People stop me in the street and say that to me all the time. I think what is important is that local people feel that they have ownership of their representative, and to do that you have to have some local input. There's no doubt about that in terms of selecting people. But you also have to have people who you can go with a slate to the country and say, this is going to be, as Jenny hopes to do, this is your new government, this is the next government. And to do that, you have to have trust in them from the leadership down. And so I understand it from both sides, but I do think there has to absolutely be local input into selecting candidates, because that's what's needed.
George, very quickly.
Purging people who do not agree with you on every particular does not make you a strong leader. It makes you a weak leader.
Is it a purge or just a selection?
No one is saying
He's clearly using the most ridiculous pretext to knock people off that list. And that is a sign of weakness, not a sign of strength.
No, there is a very lively...
Robin, one word answer. Are you more or less scared of Keir Starmer than you were before?
Less, and I think the problem is he's not allowing generally strong local candidates to come forward. I don't think this is a question of left or right. I've got in my constituency, I've got two brilliant local Labour councillors, either of whom I would have been seriously worried about being my contestant. Neither of them have been selected. Instead, we got a list of people from London.
I'm going to stop you there. We've run out of time. I'll be back with newscast after question time. See you then. Bye.
Wow. As a Labour member, I know, love. I know. That hurt. That hurt. Yeah, that hurt. Gotta admit, that was a bit painful to listen to, and it was made quite obvious. Yeesh. I really would like to hear what Phil's got to say on this, because he doesn't always agree with Starmer himself. I'd like to hear what he's got to say on this, because he's had major problems with how Corbyn did his stuff. So Yeah, that's, oh, I don't like that at all. That hurts. That really hurts. But for the most part, that one made sense, and then it just, that was very awkward. That's, again, I'm not going to be a hypocrite myself. That hurt to hear that. But will I vote for Lib Dems? No. Well, that depends, actually. It's just tactical voting. Down where I live, if it's more likely to be Lib Dems that win, I'll vote Lib Dem. But I'm a Labour member, so ordinarily I'm going to vote Labour, because that's the policy area that I agree with. That's how it is. I'm not going to not vote, because that in of itself gives his vote to the Tories. I saw that growing up throughout the last decade. So let me know what you guys think. I thought that was very painful. That was extraordinarily painful to listen to. Let me know what you guys think. Oh, that was horrid. I won't do that again. I'll catch you guys soon. It's been Shadow Eater. Please like, please subscribe, and I would love to hear some of your comments to some of the other things, to everything said today. There's some really good points made here, and I love how the biodiversity thing's been brought into national news. So, from Shadow Eater, and from Freya, and from Lady Sif, I will say Haran Gokveld, and blessed Thursday, everyone. Have a good evening.